Good morning, colleagues. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a speaker at this conference, the ISCAR Conference 2020. We really wanted to come to Brazil, and we're very sorry that we were not able to be there, but we are there in spirit, and I hope that my presentation will also be able to share that. So the presentation that I'm going to be doing today is a presentation titled Expansive Learning and Agency from Below. And it's a work that we've been trying to do to surface ethico-political expansions with sustainability and the common good in mind. I'm going to start by giving a bit of an overview of where I speak from. I'm going to also be just giving some thoughts on crisis, going to share some experiences of expansive learning with commoning activity for sustainability and the common good, and especially focus in on surfacing ethico-political expansions in chat research. And then I'm going to focus towards emancipatory agency from below, transgressing the normalized in times of crisis. So where do I speak from? I speak from a university in the Global South called Rhodes University, where I work with you can see very creative, energetic colleagues. And we've been working in a research program here for the last 30-something years now, since 1990. We established the first research chair in environmental education at Rhodes University. And you can see from the picture here that our university is here in the south, on the southern coast, just a bit off there. And we have students that come from all over the African continent to learn and work with us on how to deal with the many environment and social justice challenges that we have on the continent, and what the implications of those are for education. So here's the group of researchers that I've been working with in the last 10 to 12 years that have been working specifically with the post-Vygotskian project of cultural historical activity theory. And I'll share a lot of that work with you as I go through here, just to acknowledge them and to recognize the incredible work that they've been doing in their communities across the different countries in Africa, and with different groups of people around different sustainability concerns. And I'll share that with you too as we go along. I want to start with just thinking a little bit about crisis. And this image here has been produced by the Stockholm Resilience Institute at Stockholm University, a very big group of researchers who've been trying to study planetary boundaries and what is happening with the geo-historical genesis, you could call it. Well, actually, it's a result of the socio-cultural genesis that we've produced over the last 200-300 years, as we've embraced fossil capital and as we've been producing increasing inequalities such that the world's richest 1% have more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. At the same time, we are losing our ecosystems. We have facing a 60% loss of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, very, very serious issues. We are also facing the problem of not being able to reduce our carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and that is changing the planetary climate systems, as we've seen, and it produces surprises and shocks and sort of unexpected events, such as the floods that we've just seen in Germany, the heat waves in North America, the droughts that we ourselves have been experiencing here. So there's something going on which is producing this crisis. And of course, these things intersect, and they most often affect the world's poorest people first and most. So this is where we speak from, and this is what we've been trying to understand and deal with in our research in Southern Africa. And I like this piece from Mogensen and Dung, who are trying to look at Vygotsky's theory in relation to global changes. And they say that the natural, historical, cultural constitute a larger presence in human affairs. Disjunctures play out on the border between the phylogenetic, what I've called this geohistorical dimension of that, and cultural historical domains. For example, the breakdown of ecological sustainability has global causes, but lacks genuinely global political solutions. And this is, I think, one of the major challenges that we're dealing with, but not only around ecological sustainability issues, but also social justice issues. So here's a picture of my country last week, week before. We had a massive uprising which is a form of state insurgency, and also related to lack of jobs. 70 up to 78% of our young people don't have employment. We also have massive gender-based violence that's constantly on the go. We have poverty. We have a breakdown. You can see this picture here in our sanitation management systems. That is our wastewater treatment plants all failing. And it has consequences like this for communities who are living in poverty. And we also are facing, you know, this threat of increased heating as a result of climate change, which is also occurring already. So these are the kinds of things we're dealing with. And we can ask ourselves what kind of learning and agency are producing this intersecting crisis of poverty and inequality, joblessness, looting, gender-based violence. You can see here military violence, police violence, as they try to quell the other forms of violence, climate threats, infrastructure failure, and more. What kinds of agency and world making are we witnessing or has been constituted? This is South Africa 30 to 100 years ago. In the time that I was growing up, we were living in apartheid South Africa, and we were going through 1976 when I was a child. We had the shooting of school children as they were protesting the language of their education. We had the very stark apartheid, black and white, and we had the freedom struggle. We had a border war. We had people deep down in the mines, you know, digging out the gold to fuel the capitalists, and so on. And eventually we had Nelson Mandela released from prison. So you can ask questions again, you know, how was this kind of crisis constituted as socio-historical reality? What kinds of agency and world making were we witnessing then? And one can move beyond and behind the 100-year line in our historical analysis and ask, you know, what sits in the histories of our objects today? And we are seeing increasing studies and analyses which say that, you know, understanding these issues from a capitalist point of view alone is not adequate. We know that making of global capitalism is a huge issue, and that it has long roots. It has long roots in colonialism, as you can see up here, and white supremacy, patriarchy, and we see it's morphing right up till the most recent World Economic Forum, where they're looking at the notion of stakeholder capitalism. So capitalism morphs, but it has these other roots, patriarchy and coloniality. So we need to broaden our gaze as we do our research and be able to, you know, think about what these contradictions, where the contradictions actually come from, in order to fully address them. So this raises a question whether our diagnosis of and our engagement with the core contradiction and geohistorical and sociocultural histories in our society are adequate for the times, and by implication also whether our work in university are adequate for the times. And there's a big movement also, as we know, decolonizing the university, decolonizing epistemic work, and so on, that is of course pointing in this direction to us. So we can draw on these perspectives as we try to understand what we're doing in our own local contexts. So we see that there's a need for a new ethical, political, and aesthetic common sense, which is solidarity, participatory, and regenerative in nature. And we need emancipatory powers of agency to be emerging from the deep histories of this pernicious, violent, and destructive forms of world making that have brought us to where we are today. And so we can ask the question, you know, do we need to more consciously center the ethico-political and aesthetic of well-being in our research and praxis, including in our chat research? And of course, we can say yes to that question, but it's how to do that. That's really the question that I want to deal with in this presentation. So one of the things then is to look into the dialectical method, and the dialectical method understands the world in terms of internally related contradictions that unfold over time. And Marx gave us the central contradiction of use and value and exchange value from his research on capital and labor in Europe at the turn of the 19th century. We can ask, how is this still related to the crisis of the present? And we only have to look at vaccine apartheid, for example, and the issues around who owns the vaccines and the lack of capacity to share these adequately across the planet, and what that is actually producing in terms of inequality, to say, yes, of course, some of that is still valid. But for me, I think there's a question about the contradiction of use value and exchange value, whether it's adequate in scope, in other words, necessary but insufficient for what we are witnessing today in places where colonial modernity continues to impact so perniciously at the level of geohistory. So the geohistorical and sociocultural is part of our daily microgenetics, and it produces new kinds of contradictions. And these kind of show up, you know, out of forms of fascism, neocolonialism, global capitalism, offshore pollution, vaccine apartheid, ongoing extraction and destruction of planetary systems and resources such as the, you know, crucially important Amazon forest, as we all know. So the question that I have and that we've been talking about in our research community is, do we need to expand the ethico-political meanings of this contradiction for analytical purchase? And I'll come back to that towards the end of my presentation. And when we look at the issue of crisis, I also looked at this question of agency from below, and what are we seeing? What's the biggest pattern when we look at agency from below? And it's a pattern that looks a bit like this. It's a pattern of protest. Now, South Africa has one of the highest rates of protest in the world. And it is a sociocultural practice that people use when they fail to get purchase to actually transform their lives. And here is something going on globally. We can see, you know, protest against patenting of the vaccines. We can see protests against gender-based violence, Black Lives Matter, climate change, pollution, people's safety. It's just crazy that the whole planet has to rely on protest as it seems like the most accessible form or manifestation of our agency in times of crisis. So we can ask a question about, you know, that is of course extremely important because it's a barometer of what's going on in society, but is it adequate? And this, I think, is a question for educators. You know, what is the role of education in this story here? So is there a problem in learning research? You know, what is happening in learning research and how do we do better learning research if we want to try to think about emancipatory agency beyond the protest? And it's so interesting to me, this children's protest that just erupted across the planet. One little girl with protesting for climate action from adults. We will go to school if you keep the climate cool. And it just catalyzed this massive global protest amongst school children. Now we can ask ourselves the question, what's going on here? Do we understand what this means for education and for learning research? I don't think we do. And I think that this is part of the challenge that we have in these times. So I looked also into some of the literature. Morgenson and Dang say that the cultural historical circumstances have changed. Much human development now takes place in settings in which spatiality has been pluralized and global activity and imaginaries are omnipresent alongside more locally bound activities. And we can understand something like this if we can see, you know, that perspective, the spatiality and of course the technology shifts that we've been experiencing. And what I was interested also in this point from Vygotsky, where he says where upheavals occur, where the historical fabric is ruptured, the naive mind sees only catastrophic gaps in discontinuity. History seems to stop dead until it once again takes the direct linear path of development. And this for me is what's going on. What is the next path, or what is the path of development that needs to emerge from this kind of crisis moment in our societies? This really is a picture which broke my heart. It's a picture of a little child following the recent looting and protests in KwaZulu-Natal, standing on the street when the president came to see what the fallout of this situation was. And he's sort of, the poster says, "My future has been looted." And next to him is my mother, "My small and 1-month-old business has been looted." And so I reached, you know, back into the literatures on environment and education and Vygotsky, and came across this work of Leonid Tev's, which has also been something we've been working with, but it just reminded me again that what is going on here and how to approach these issues. So it says, in the process of socio-historical development, the very makeup of the environment changes. the social conditions of human existence take on a certain material form for the human being, they also appear in the form of secondary superstructural formations, that is, in the form of language. So it took me into thinking about, protest and experience and the materiality of the crisis that people are experiencing. And going back to Cole and Scribner, who say that in his notion that the mind should be understood in terms of a Marxist theory of the history of human society, Vygotsky laid the foundation for a unified behavioral science. And then I was thinking, well, with this, how do we make sense of children's protest erupting out of education systems as the most dominant expression and form of agency for change in the here and now? And how to make sense of simultaneously witnessing children's futures being expressed as looted. So the question that came to me as I was preparing this keynote is, do we need to give more attention to the mutual presence of the geohistorical and the sociocultural genesis as dialectically related to the ontogenic and microgenic in our research, with the latter being more dominant in education research? And this, I think, is part of the challenge that we're facing. And Vygotsky makes this point: revolution and evolution are two mutually connected forms of development that presuppose one another. I looked into the educational research journals. I just picked some of the top ranking ones with impact factors between 1.5 and 8. And I wanted to just see, how are educational researchers responding to some of these dimensions of crisis, if at all, given that these are also not short-term, these are crises of long durée, as I indicated earlier. So we'll see that the highest response in these journals, very well-known, high-profile educational journals, the strongest response over time has been gender, dealing with the gender issues, followed by post-colonial studies, which is these sort of brownish bits over here, followed by environmental education, which is these little bits of yellow here. You can see little bits pink. And then almost nothing on climate change education, education for sustainability, decoloniality, which seem to be almost invisible, and the artificial intelligence risk, which is a whole subject on its own, is almost not present. So, we can ask ourselves the question, what's going on in the main with educational research? Of course, there are people publishing about these things, but they seem to be mostly in the fringe, on the edges, in the fringe journals. So what does it say about educational research? For me, this is a really interesting question. So I asked myself this question: are we at a crossroads in the educational and learning sciences? And what can cultural historical activity theory research offer us now? And is family, school, community, university, research community, and society so subjected to the crisis of global society that we can do little but use our agentive powers to ignore, learn about, protest against, and inadvertently reproduce the intersecting cultural histories of colonial modernity? And with this, are we becoming victim to a pernicious form of neo-positivism, often in the name of transformation? And is there a paradox here that we need to overcome or try to deal with? Are we confronted with an intractable paradox? Is that which arises on the social plane first so intractable, dominant, fragmented, or dispersed that we are unable to substantively transform cultures and activities that are damaging our well-being and that of our planet? So here's the challenge for us. And Morgensen and Dang ask this kind of a question about the Vygotskian project in their work. They say, does Vygotsky's method remain explanatory in a world where spatiality is multidimensional? Mobility continuously enhances the possibility of agency. Identity is more plural and global elements are much more potent. What insights can his theorization provide? Are genetic domains and mediation adequate to the analytical task? And does his conceptual framework require renovation or augmentation to remain functional? Or does the more connected world explode his foundational assumptions? In short, does Vygotsky's socially and historically nested psychology continue to offer useful tools for investigating, interpreting, and explaining human development and education? So in a way, I'm also trying to speak to this, and I'm doing it by sort of tuning in and working with some of the recent debates and emergent trajectories in cultural historical activity theory. And I was first drawn to this work in 2005 when I read the work of Anne Edwards, who raised, this. She said that in the future, we have these three challenges for learning research: working on new problems, working with instability and uncertainty, and working with distributed knowledge and expertise. I've also been interested in the work of Anna Stetsenko and the transformative activist stance, and particularly a recent challenge in Mind, Culture and Activity, where she calls for ethico-political explanations and roles for researchers in chat in the context of socio-political and historical turmoil. And I've been working now for maybe 13 years with the Helsinki project, Cultural Historical Activity Theory Research. We really liked that because of its focus on activity and transforming human activity in collectives. And I'll show more about that as I go along. And we've been journeying along with Uriel Engstrom and Annalisa Sanino on trying to understand the problems around the complexity of contemporary objects and what that means for chat research, and trying to come to understand how to do research in such contexts with the chat project. And we've been very much privileged to have both of them as visiting professors in our university. So we've been able to come to understand the new work that's coming through in fourth generation cultural historical activity theory, and also appreciate the social solidarity intentions and the reframing of the global capitalist trajectory and its impacts that this work is trying to address in this fourth generation of chat research. And in February last year, Annalisa and Uriel came into the research school with us. And I was so excited and interested by this, where Uriel talked about three dimensions of expansion of the object: the socio-spatial dimension, in other words, the extension of actors; the temporal dimension, which is how far into the future does the object and the past does the object reach; and then the ethical-political dimension, which is what are the consequences, who benefits and who takes responsibility. And then one of the things that Uriel said, which has made us all really think very deeply about what we're doing and what the contribution of our work is into the space, is he talked about the point that ethico-political expansion needs work. And by that he was saying we needed conceptual frameworks and ways of coming to understand this in the here and now. So that's really the challenge that we've been trying to deal with, and what I want to deal with more in this presentation today. So I'm going to share now some experiences of expansive learning within commoning activity as it's been coming up in our research, where we've been surfacing ethico-political expansions. So in doing that, it's been important for us to work out how to center the research. And so we looked into the work of Vygotsky on environment and learning. And then this sort of discussion on that, this paper by Leonatev being very helpful for kind of working through some of that. But both of them essentially warned that through abstraction of concerns such as crisis, the learner can be removed from the real process of life, from the interaction that is his or her real existence. So Leonatev says that the relationship between a person and the environment is defined not by the environment and not by abstract properties of his or her personality, but specifically by the content of his or her activity, by the level of development of this activity, if it can be expressed in this way, by its structure and formation. So any object of their activity, even a natural one, becomes a human object, that is a social object. Even food becomes a social object. And with regards to crisis, Leonatev goes on and says that the influence of the external situation is not in the experiencing of the subject, but rather specifically in the content of his or her activity. Consequently, it is in activity and not in social experience that the true unity of the subject and his or her reality, personality and environment is realized. And we can see that in the data. So here's some data from women who are working with improved cook stoves, and they're talking about these stoves, and they say the stoves use firewood as a type of fuel, and they save firewood so that the forests should regenerate in our area because the forests have diminished and we are receiving low rainfall. If we would be using the stoves, forests would regenerate. And this is from Experiencia Jalasi's work, which I'll share with you a bit more about later too. So you can see this sort of like manifestation in that, you know, the very practical work of cooking food. So experiencing lacks its own movement. Only the unity of activity and experience, and not experience as such, contains the internal driving force of the psychological development of humans. And for me, here is also the space where one can think about the shift from protest to, you know, the shift in emancipatory agency as protest to transformed activity, human activity. So something important there that I think still needs some time to really make sense of. So just to come back to this amazing team of researchers, they've all been working on chat-informed formative interventions in concrete contexts over the last 10 to 13 years, where deep-seated contradictions between exclusion and commodification and inclusion and coexistence are producing local-level crises, or what we call matters of concern. And specifically, but also collectively, they focus on what we've called commoning activity of various forms around complex objects, typically characterized by intersecting and tension-laden dynamics of society, environment, economy, which is the root of the crisis that we're talking about today, arising from colonial modernity's contradictions. Here's a full list of the different kinds of commoning activities that people are working on. This group of researchers have been working on, such as management of wetlands, restoration activities in natural resources management, use of energy-saving cook stoves, ocean governance, community-based irrigation scheme management, township enterprise development, waste management, green economy activities, sustainable agriculture, water harvesting and seed sharing, farmers, cooperatives development, and so much more. Citizen-based water quality monitoring is a huge one. I showed you the picture of our wastewater treatment the systems just falling apart, which means we've literally got shit running into every single river in the country. So there's a need for these kinds of commoning activities, and a very big interest in them actually in the research communities. So most of these commoning activities have been or are being engaged and transformed via what in-depth formative interventions using activity system and contradictions analysis with the involved activity systems, together with expansive learning processes using Engestrom's third generation chat, change laboratories, the expansive learning cycle with transformative agency analysis. But some of these have actually morphed into fourth generation chat studies, where double stimulation processes with diverse streams of activity, partnerships and coalitions seem to provide the critical nexus of psychological development. And we're also still trying to make better sense of that as we go along. But some of them can't seem to hold themselves in the change laboratories. They seem to break out into some other form of expansive learning and agency development. So typically our studies would look something like this, where we have these sort of multiple intersecting activity systems. We always focus them into the grassroots or the community activity systems, where the challenges are most pertinent or most strongly felt by people, especially the most marginal people, more marginalized people. Then we look at the interacting activity systems that are influencing the practices or the object of activity, especially the complex objects around poverty and sustainability challenges. And then we look into the policy activity systems, the education activity systems, and so on. So most often we have these sort of multi-layered, the pink, the purple, and the orange, and I'm going to keep up with the pink, the purple, and the orange in terms of these levels of activity system, because there's something interesting happening there. This is a picture of transformative agency pathways with these pink, orange, and purple activity systems. And the green here is where the transformative agency pathways have been successful. This comes from Experiencia Jalasi's research. And you can see where the struggles are for successful transformative agency is not so much with the communities, but actually with these institutions, the higher level institutions. So this is something very interesting to fully perceive and then begin to think about in terms of the fourth generation chat that is emerging. So here's some examples. I'll just show them via pictures so that you can get a feel for the spaces that we're doing our research in. This is a huge project that was led by Teach Besanaya, but a whole lot of other researchers have been working together on it over a period of about 8 years now, since 2014. And in the beginning, we did a number of change laboratories, quite intensive ones. And then after that, we started to branch out using mostly double stimulation tools that had become very well used, and people were quite comfortable with them, such as productive demonstration sites. And a training of trainers program and use of a WhatsApp group and so on. So, and you can see in the beginning, we had a few activity systems, local activity systems, and some of the more national ones. And then later on, other local activity systems joined. And so you can see the expansion of the activities. You can also see the expansion of the object of activity, and especially its sort of ethico-political expansion, which is what I wanted to show you here. So we've started to look at some of the dimensions of the ethico-political expansion in these data sets. And here you can see what people were doing. They were reclaiming their culture and their epistemic foundations, and they established a cooperative practice called Ilima, which is to work together to produce food, which had been marginalized by the kind of monoculture approaches to agriculture and by the land's marginalization of people from their land. Epistemic justice by claiming indigenous knowledge practices, which were established long before the scientists like the Water Research Commission started to write about rainwater harvesting practices. Claiming sovereignty, especially through practices such as seed banks and seed sharing. Sustainability sensibilities, very strong actually on the ground amongst farming communities, looking for practices that are more sustainable, that are not going to destroy their soils and so on. Intergenerational concern, also very strong. Solidarity and empathy with each other, and especially other people who get affected by, for example, droughts or unequal distribution of resources and so on. There's a solidarity and empathy that was very strong in the data coming through. And then also power, knowledge, sensibility, and especially thinking about how to use knowledge and access knowledge. What training can people get to be part of? And they established this fantastic WhatsApp learning network that's been going for 9-10 years, where people share knowledge with each other, solve their problems on this WhatsApp kind of platform. And the kind of focus here, this expansion of the object, is to try to break this vicious cycle of poverty and hunger, and to become more independent as farmers, to produce food for families and local communities. Here's another case study, again, a big group of researchers, and they are all of them with us or at least some of them are with us at the ISCAR conference, so please do look out for their presentations. Charles Chikunda and Ruben Tifulufelwe. You can, he'll challenge you to say his name. But here, these researchers are working on issues of land restitution, getting the land back, because most Black people in South Africa were disenfranchised of their land. The colonists and the apartheid government took them off the land and put them into marginal areas. So there's a whole project of resettlement and giving back the land. And with this, people needing to form common property associations and structures and approaches to managing the land. So here again, you can see the initial activity systems, the local level ones, the pink ones, the more national ones, and then these expanded local ones and more sort of national and international activity systems all coming together here. So this case is also very interesting from an ethico-political expansion dimension. And I just wanted to show you some of these. I won't go through the detail, but very assertive in terms of demands for power shifts, actually naming and saying, we don't want the government to hold its power. They must move from their position of power. They mustn't have the final say on everything. They must devolve their power. They must transfer power of control, you see. And then they say, but they have to do that with training. People want training in order to take up their own power. So they are, quite assertive here in terms of what they're wanting. They're also evidencing critical understandings of historical power relations and framing alternatives. So here they're talking about the generals, which were the Italian generals that were put onto that land by the colonial government in order to monopolize the farming potential of the land. Beautiful land, very rich soils and so on. But these generals were quite vicious, actually, in the way that they were dealing with communities. And so there's this kind of historical memory of this colonial violence. And they are saying, you know, really, in those days, generals were just using the people and they were not skilling them. And hence they want to be skilled so that they can actually take control and ownership of their common property association and its management. They also undertake very sophisticated analysis of the process that is needed to achieve the power shifts. And here they're talking about the different options they've been looking at. They don't want chances. They want to link up with agriculture. They want education and skills development. And then they also look at, you know, the way of addressing this power knowledge nexus problem. And then they say, yeah, we're ready to learn. And what we want is we want training programs for our young people. So in sum, then, if you look at this, you know, you can see that these communities are articulating the power-laden contradiction and the double bind that they're experiencing around these power-related issues. And then they're also articulating and enacting conditions for emancipatory agency from below. And you can see here that they, you know, we've called it Power 1 and Power 2 after ISCAR, who talks about the powers inherent in agency, in emancipatory agency, and the forms of oppression. So as these forms of oppression, they challenge them in order to expand get to the ethico-political expansion of the object, which in this case was then a common property association agreement, management plans, youth training programs, and so on. So they were successful actually in achieving what it is that they wanted in terms of transforming the object of their activity, which is to get back the land. So here's another case study, which is the work of Experiencia Jalasi. She's also here at the ISCAR conference, so look out for her paper. And she's been working on a very interesting case study in Malawi, where there's a problem with deforestation. All the women cook with wood. So they go and collect wood. You can see here in the corner here, this picture of the woman with the wood on their head. And because there's deforestation, the women are having to walk further and further away. And of course, it's a climate change challenge as well. So what's been happening is that there's been an international donor-led project with the government, and they've introduced literally 2 million of these improved cook stoves. But what Experiencia found was that the women were stacking the cook stoves in their kitchens and not using them. And so she wanted to understand what was happening here, what were the contradictions, and how did the system actually operate, what was going on. So she started working with the women stove users, and over a number of change laboratories and in a number of case study sites, she did some fantastic work with them in terms of transformative agency and emancipation, and moving their practice in this sort of towards this empowerment of the women in order to address the challenges that they were experiencing on the ground. And these are women that are, if I could say, you know, most of them are living on less than $1 or $2 a day. So these are not wealthy women. So, you know, to work in this way is truly emancipatory in itself, you know, and to strengthen the emancipatory agency of the woman really offers quite a lot to our understanding of how to move forward in society today. So in this research, again, you can see these dimensions of ethico-political expansion, and I'm not going to go through them all because it'll take too long, but you can see, you know, solidarity practices where they kind of are concerned. These are the most vulnerable women who are concerned with others that are more vulnerable than them. You see the solidarity practice very strong, empathy very strong. Here they're talking about the pain that they have when they have to use their bare hands to make these clay stoves. The inclusivity, they actually rejected one of the stove models because it was built in such a way that only the adults could sit around it, and it left the children outside of the homestead. So they said, no, you know, we don't want that because the family can't sit around the fire source. And that, of course, is very important in the culture. They also take a strong cooperative stance with organizations and others, sustainability sensibilities again, thinking about tomorrow, they want a sustainable practice. They also are, quite politically engaged, especially with the local politics, and they know what kind of collaborations are needed between the chiefs and the health surveillance assistant, you can see here. Gender equity is also on their agenda, men and women, reframing of power relations, identifying their own agentive powers, knowing what they can do and how to do it, and then also the political option deliberations where they're talking about how the politics should actually be operating when it isn't operating in that particular way. So very sophisticated ethico-political practices here in the process of expanding the object. And so you see from this coming this emancipatory agency from below and expansion of the ethico-political in the object. And they say here, this approach can help us in many different developmental projects. Sometimes in our communities, we wait for others to bring us development. But if we can use these approaches, it will help us to develop our lives on our own and fill the gaps. So you can see the taking up of independence and control of the development logic and practice. So out of these types of studies, and there are many of them, I haven't even been able to count how many of these case studies there are, but there's at least 50 case studies like this in our research, what you call archive here, is we've also been trying to develop analytical tools for ethico-political expansion. And Ruben, who's also at the ISCAR conference, is leading the frontier, and he's been really trying to look at how do we do this, especially in these complex, where we've got these complex intersecting activity systems and pathways, expansive learning pathways. So here he's got the restoration activity systems, the rulemaking activity systems, the governance activities, all on their own expansive learning trajectory, and all trying to deal with the sort of central power dynamic contradiction, which is, continues to exclude local people. So he's been looking at the issues of subjugation and control of agentic capabilities and collaborative agentic capabilities and the top-down and cooperative types of governance, and then looking at the spearheads or what's coming out in terms of ethical political expansion from this particular type of contradiction, and then looking at it in terms of the expansive learning process and these shifts from power one, power two dialectic, and how that produces shifts in the transformative agency pathway. And developing the tools for this has been quite difficult because it's not easy to see until you have tools to see them. So this is part of the challenge of what we've been doing. And then we've got these different zones of proximal development that I'll talk about just now as well. But in these zones of proximal development, we see ethico-political expansion of the objects that are orientated towards sustainability and the common good. But this comes via the regenerative struggles of redressing alienation, marginalization causes, subjugation, especially, the colonial modernity's pernicious effects, especially poverty, racism, loss of land, biodiversity and loss, disruption of cultural assets such as knowledges, languages, and coexistence practice. So there's kind of a, they want to regenerate and get out of that kind of mess. And the sustainability and the common good offers options to produce these new zones of proximal development for activity. There's a clear pattern in these of seeking out well-being or improvement of the conditions of life for communities, children, families, which involves recognition, epistemic and social justice, and sustainability of life supporting systems and the means of production. So this, I think, is the seeds of regenerative cultures that benefit excluded communities and damaged ecologies. So we can see, these zones of proximal development becoming very important to understand what's going on there. And I'll talk about that as I move towards the end. So sustainability and common good are not a historical fact or an ideal only, but they are an emergent facing forward zone of proximal development in commoning activities. So this is something for us to think about. And almost in all cases, these objects are particularly complex, and the objects, the sustainability or commoning activity objects, are they political and they're complex. And they have socio-material dialectical features, cultural, historical, local, global, as well as ethico-political dialectical features. And particularly the ethico-political dialectical features here are inclusion, exclusion, marginalization, redress, degradation, and sustainability or regeneration, and then greed and exploitation and coexistence. And you can see it in all of the data sets. So if you start looking into the data set, so here's a story about the farmers who are struggling without getting water to their lands, and they're saying that their crops are burning, and they're really upset because somebody, the sort of local municipality, took the diesel engine that was providing power to pump the water for them. And so they say that it's the concern of everyone, especially in this point in time where drought is affecting a lot of communities. So you can see this intersection of the ethico-political dialectical features pretty much in most of the data sets as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the double stimulation tools and transformative agency processes as well, because this has been very much important in the work. So in Vygotsky, the tool is externally orientated and it must lead to changes in objects. And we've been working particularly with Annalisa's work on transformative agency and her work that she did with the on double stimulation in the weighting experiment. And it's very important that here, I think, is where the agency power lies, is where people are able to confront their conflicts of motive that arise within the first stimulus, using the double stimulation tools, through which they then subject themselves to the power of the tools, and they then convert the stimulus into an auxiliary motive, which makes them serve their own purposes, and in the process control that power as they see fit. So this is the work of Annalisa that's really helped us to see that so much. But for me, there's something very important sitting in there around emancipatory agency and especially democracy. And I'll talk about that. It's like the point of democracy, where the singular act of democracy, and that's ethico-political in the context that we find ourselves in, these, hundreds of years of subjugation. So it's where people can push that out, that hundreds of years of subjugation is here, the point of democracy. So I think, I wish I had more time to reflect on this, but it's so exciting to begin to see that. So in this way, it's possible to change the environment through activity and in the process affect their own behavior, subjecting this to their own authority. So the issue of volitional will is so important in this process. So here's some examples of the double stimulation tools. I'll just be quick with them. Here's the woman with their cook stoves struggling because they're poor and they don't have pots with handles, because the pot with a handle is expensive. And their pots, they cook for big families, so the pots are shifting off these so-called improved cook stoves. So what Experiencia did was that she found this picture of a woman who was holding the pot down with a stick, a forked stick, and she showed that to the woman, and then they tried it out and they were able to solve their problem, and they were then able to use this improved cook stove. Now, we might think that this is a small thing, but in fact, it's got geohistorical significance, because it's an act which actually is reducing climate change, ultimately, you see. So there's these small things at the micro level that have these bigger geohistorical implications. Here we have the seeds with the farmers, and they often use seeds and the diversity of seeds that are available in the cultures in order to claim sovereignty for food production. So this is very interesting practice as well, and double stimulation tool. There's lots of other double stimulation tools that have been developed, and one of the interesting things about them is that here Titch, who's one of our researchers who we sadly lost a couple of years ago, he says that in many cases, my planned second stimuli were modified by participants to better stimuli that helped them to analyze their situations and enable modeling of their solutions. Hence, second stimuli were mostly co-constructed by participants and the researcher. And we've been looking into the implications of this notion of the co-construction of the second stimuli. And it links to Annalisa's point about double stimulation in collectives not being the same as when it's being used with individuals. So we've been asking which double stimulation tools are working and have been working, have we developed, and so on. And so the co-construction of double stimulation tools seems to be very important, because here we started off with practical demonstrations that were given to people. Then they started to build these practical demonstrations together, and this practice of the practical demonstration has just like taken off all over the community and continues until this day. So hence you see the double stimulation process becoming, almost taking its own life outside of the change laboratory. Co-constructed agreements are also important, using information communication technologies, apps and WhatsApp. These activity system modeling practices, very important. And then other things like training of trainers, projects with change project assignments, learning network mapping, and so on. So we see a lot of double stimulation tool production, very interesting and exciting. And I think we need to write a few papers on this. We're a bit slow to write up all of this work, but we're getting there. And then this is the one that really interests me, which is the double stimulation tools that are co-constructed, which are innovating in modalities, but also have quite a high level of ethico-political movement purchase, if I could call it that. So here's a project that is a huge project where they've been using co-constructed mobile playback empatheater. It's a particular type of theater methodology that's been developed by Dylan McGarry and his team in ocean governance, and they do research in the community, surface the contradictions, develop a play around those, and then they mirror that back to communities all along the coast. And they've been mirroring this up and down the system, the pink to the orange, all the way up to the UN. They've been using this, this double stimulation process tool to, you know, produce transformative agency and ethico-political expansion of their object. This one is also very interesting. Gibson and Mpepu in Malawi, also working with rural women there. And they used scenario modeling, which is an approach used in environmental sciences. And what is really interesting here is that the women constructed these scenarios mostly around care for the children, but represented them in symbols that were to convince the men in their community. So they were trying to drive a transformation of gender relationships here out of their care and concern for the children. And this became a collective double stimulation tool for the whole community, which then drove quite a huge expansive learning process and transformative agency activities in the community. So this co-development of the double stimulation tool, very important. So here you see then out of these things, there's more and more evidence of this ethico-political expansion. And for me, it looks to me like there's this something emancipatory agency and the singular act of democracy, when people are able to stand up and, you know, use their volitional will in order to take these decisions to advance their activity in ways that are resonant with their cultures, histories, and their politics. So here you can see this man saying, traditions are important. Even if you don't believe in them, you must respect them and the sea. Let's fight for our heritage as well as our natural treasures, coming from the ocean work, ocean governance work. So we've then been trying to sort of summarize some of this, looking at the observed ethico-political expansions in the objects. There's a lot of dimensions here, from marginalization to claiming human rights, from silenced and ignored to hermeneutic justice, from abjection and subjugation to cognitive justice, shifting these oppressive power relations, and so on. And so if we look at the sort of dialectic here, it looks to us like, or looks to me like, a colonial modernity's impacts and epistemologies, and the dialectic of regenerative cultures and epistemologies. And you can see that emerging in the data sets, as I showed you earlier. And I think that this is important for the geohistorical and also sociocultural genesis work. So to come back to Engelstrom's challenge, he said, yes, ethico-political expansion needs work. And I would say, yes, it does. It needs ongoing work. And it needs an explicit kind of axiologically centered work in chat. It should be orientated, or could be orientated, or becomes orientated to sustainability and the common good. It's not ideologically predetermined, as a lot of sustainability education is, but it's dialectically emergent from real needs and aspirations for health, safety, well-being, livelihoods, land, water, food, communal care, solidarity relations, viable trajectories and opportunities for young people. And all of these are related to transformation of historical effects of colonial modernity. So I think the chat, we're so excited, has an important focus of co-constructing, or is an important process of co-constructing regenerative cultures from the ground up. If I look across all of this work, you can see that emerging. And it's so interesting to be able to look across all of this work. And that, of course, brings one into the notion of methodology. So how do you secure your observational and explanatory benefits while reducing the intellectual costs of closure? So we don't want to make closure here, but we don't want to produce universal theory, but we want to look at what this process actually means. And I really liked Vygotsky's approach to the genetic method, which enabled him to be one at the same time empirically bound, coherent in selective inquiries, comprehensively explanatory, and partly open theoretically. So as we offer what we're offering, it's in that spirit here. So I want to now just move towards wrapping up on the topic of emancipatory agency from below and transgressing the normalized. And just to say that we've seen in all of our cases this expansive learning and transformative agency, and it shows that expansive learning can and does lead to transformative agency amongst some of the world's most marginalized people who find themselves in very difficult circumstances. And so we've kept on asking ourselves, what makes transformative agency emancipatory? And for me, it's, we can now see that it's ultimately the ethico-political expansions which indicate if transformative agency is emancipatory for those concerned or not, because you could have transformative agency and be producing a degenerative cultural practice, rather than a regenerative cultural practice. So that's the way that ethico-political dialectic becomes very much important. And we need this to go on at all of these levels with the orange activity systems and the purple ones and the pink ones, if we are going to be successful in the long term. So we want to offer, this picture here, I think, for ethico-political research in chat. The overlay of these zones of proximal development, when you start to look at them all, and I'm going to do that now, take all 40, 50 of them, overlay them and look at what are they saying in terms of your micro and ontogenesis, because that's what we're seeing at this level of study in communities. And then what is the implications for sociocultural genesis and geohistorical genesis? And here we're looking at, getting closer to more benign human nature relations and balance, more and stronger inclusion, epistemic and social economic justice, and these regenerative cultures, and to kind of characterize those more carefully out of the empirical work, and to move away from exploitation, extraction, commodification, and unsustainability, which has produced the crisis that we're in today, and exclusion and marginalization, which has produced this massive wealth gap. So these are the degenerative cultures that we actually want to move away from, out of colonial modernity and into something else. And I think that this offers a different kind of social movement that extends protest as agency from below into the transformation of human activity. To go back to my slide on the protest. So some of our observations here is that these are actually sophisticated pulses of freedom and emancipation from subjection or domination, and they're willingly and collectively produced by people in the interests of sustainability and the common good. The singular act of democracy, to come back to that again, the seeds of regenerative cultures. And I think that there's a vital relationship between micro, onto, sociocultural genesis with geo-historical genesis impacts, if these can be shared extensively across the planet. And I think for that, we'll have to avoid fragmenting emancipatory forms of agency with limited views on and instruments that confine our analysis to microgenesis. And if anything, I think this talk has helped me to be able to do that, to be able to see the collective body of work that we've been working on outside of the microgenesis of each and every study. And then for this, I think we'll need to work in connected research communities across historically constructed boundaries, and to work more globally and cooperatively with our chat. And I'm so conscious of the challenges that are going on in Brazil at the moment around the Amazon and the lives of indigenous people, and why we should all care about that, because in fact it's the foundation of our ability to breathe. So we've been also using this notion of transgression, where we're looking at ethico-political purpose and motive, which includes expansive learning, or it induces expansive learning that is also transgressive, where we can challenge and transform these normalized practices that come out of the histories that I've been talking about. And to do that with critique and with courage and with empathy and with kindness and with solidarity, with disruption, with reflection, kind of Ubuntu for the common good is the closest that I can see it. And my last slide really is this piece from Rose in the Morgenson and Dahl paper. They say, we do not know what we are capable, says Rose, but we do know that our history has produced a creature, that's us, with the capacity to act upon its limits. And Sylvia Winter, who's a beautiful decolonial scholar and writer, drawing on Frans Fanon's work and many of the other decolonial thinkers, she proposes the ethico-political dialectical challenging of our dominant species image. She says our dominant species image is homo economicus. You know, we've become so greedy and just want to extract everything and sell everything and commodify everything. And we need to reclaim our species image as homo sapiens, which is a living, caring, and sharing being as praxis. And with humility, I want to claim that the women, men, and children in our studies are actually doing that. And I want to come back to this use value and exchange value contradiction that Marx gave us, which has really helped us to see the pernicious impact on labor and commodification of our natural world. But is it helping us to find and see the regenerative cultures that of Homo sapiens? And I feel like we need to extend it somehow with something like the inclusion and coexistence values, which are values that are based not on labor and commodification analysis, but on life and the air that we need to breathe. So that's where I want to leave this presentation, and to just say that this is the work of Tichaona Pesanaya, who I mentioned we lost just after he got his PhD, one of our most brilliant scholars and so kind and compassionate. And he really showed us what an formative intervention researcher is and should be. So I want to say that all of this work requires the humility of formative intervention research with the people. And he writes in his thesis, my main challenge in writing this thesis was to balance the contradiction in the object of writing, endeavoring to make sense to the common person, but also to be convincing to the academy. I therefore ground my work in my common experience with the common people to whom I owe priceless practical wisdom. And I want to acknowledge all of those people we've worked with, and also these amazing researchers that I've had the privilege to work with. I want to thank them all, and a special thanks to these three good people from Helsinki, whose generosity and work over the last 8 to 10 years has really helped us and guided us. And it's been a fantastic journey. And I want to let you know that we're trying to work on a book to share this work. We have quite a number of chapters written. We're going to, tighten it up and hopefully get it out soon. We still have to clean up the title. I like the image for the cover, and I gave it this title as I was finishing this presentation: Expansive Learning and Agency from Below, with Sustainability and the Common Good in Mind. So I want to just say thank you very much to everybody for listening to me, and I hope you have a good conference further. Thank you.